You've likely been taught that God's law began with Moses, thunder on Mount Sinai, stone tablets carved by divine fire, and a newly born nation bound to commandments it had never known before, the beginning of obedience, the origin of sacred law, the first time heaven reached down to establish order. But what if that's not where it began? What if the first Sabbath wasn't commanded in the desert, but was already known in Eden? What if Abel's offering wasn't just a gesture of devotion, but a response to a ritual taught from above? What if Adam himself walked in a rhythm of sacred time, a divine structure woven into the days, the seasons, the very breath of creation? The Book of Jubilees, long hidden from our eyes, makes a startling claim. The law did not originate at Sinai. It was reaffirmed there. It was not revealed for the first time to a wandering people, but reminded to a nation that had forgotten. It says the law was there from the very beginning, before nations, before temples, before even sin itself. It lived in the silence of the seventh day, in the purity of Abel's sacrifice, in the way Noah built his altar before the floodwaters had fully dried. So, if that's true, what else have we misunderstood about the origin of God's covenant? And if the law was never just for Israel, could it be that it was always meant for you? If the sacred covenant didn't begin in Exodus, but in Genesis, then everything we thought was foundational needs to be rewritten. Not just reinterpreted, not just updated with nuance, but fundamentally revised. Because this isn't just a theological detail, it's a shift in the entire timeline of divine-human relationship. It means the law didn't arrive late into the story as a reaction to sin or rebellion. It was there before sin entered, before Cain's jealousy, before Adam's exile. And if that's true, then the law isn't a response to failure. It's a reflection of design. It was part of the original order, not a later correction. That changes everything. Think of Abel offering the best of his flock. Jubilees says he didn't act out of instinct or emotion. He followed a sacred pattern, a law that was already known, a divine rhythm that had been taught. And Cain's offering, not just lacking in quality, but in alignment with that sacred order. Cain wasn't just jealous. He rejected something deeper, a standard that didn't begin with Moses, but with God himself. So if the law was already present, if it was given to Adam, followed by Abel, preserved by Noah, and revived by Abraham, then the question isn't, when did the law begin? It's, when did we forget it? And more importantly, if they were responsible to live by it without Sinai, without a nation, without a priesthood, then what does that mean for us? Have we misunderstood what it means to be in covenant? Have we traded something ancient and sacred for something more convenient? This isn't about history, it's about responsibility. Because if the law has always been here, then so has the call to follow it. And perhaps we were never meant to wait for the tablets on the mountain. Perhaps we were always meant to remember. In the very first week of creation, before there was sin, before there were nations, before there was even a need for redemption, God did something extraordinary. On the seventh day, he rested. And not only did he rest, he blessed that day and made it holy. According to the Book of Jubilees, this wasn't just a pause, it was the foundation. The seventh day was sanctified not for God's sake, but as a gift to humanity, a mark, a covenant, a rhythm that echoed heaven itself. Jubilees is explicit. The Sabbath wasn't introduced at Sinai. It was set apart in Eden, and Adam, the first human, was taught this rhythm, not as a suggestion, but as part of the divine order. Rest, in this context, wasn't passive. It was sacred alignment. It meant recognizing that creation had a tempo, and that life was never meant to be lived in endless toil. The Sabbath was the first law, woven into the structure of time itself. This changes how we view the covenant, because if the very first week of human history contained a commandment, a sanctified time, then the law wasn't given in response to failure. It was embedded in design. And Adam, walking in the garden, wasn't just naming animals or tending soil. He was learning to live in sync with the Creator. Time itself became a holy space, and to honor the Sabbath was to remain tethered to Eden's memory. So when Jubilees says the Sabbath was ordained in the tablets of heaven, it means more than a rule. It's a signal, a boundary line that separates those who remember from those who forget. In Eden, before exile, God gave the law, not in fear, not in punishment, but in peace, in rest, as the first act of covenant between the Creator and the created. And perhaps that's why breaking the Sabbath later in Scripture is treated so seriously, not because it's just a rule, but because it breaks the rhythm that was meant to keep us in communion with God since the very beginning. The story of Cain and Abel is often told as a tale of jealousy and uncontrolled emotion. One brother gave from the field, the other from the flock. One offering was accepted, the other rejected. And the world's first murder followed soon after. But what if this wasn't just a moral fable about anger? What if the difference between their offerings wasn't rooted in feeling, but in obedience? According to the Book of Jubilees, Abel didn't offer a sacrifice out of instinct or sentiment. He offered the firstborn of his flock and the best portions. This language isn't accidental. It mirrors the later commands given in Leviticus, long before those laws were ever formally introduced at Sinai. Abel knew what to do. He knew what kind of sacrifice pleased God, and he followed a pattern already known and taught. Cain, on the other hand, gave an offering from the ground, but Jubilees hints that it wasn't the first or the best. It wasn't according to the pattern. His sacrifice wasn't rejected because God favored sheep over crops, but because Cain didn't honor the sanctity of the offering. He gave what he wanted, not what was required. He approached the holy in his own way, while Abel honored what had already been revealed. This matters deeply, because if Abel was following a ritual, then the law, or at least elements of it, was already known. There was already a sacred standard, already a right way to approach God. And Cain's failure wasn't simply emotional, it was theological. He refused to walk in the path laid down before him. Abel accepted it, and it cost him his life. But that's what makes Abel the first martyr of obedience. He didn't die for being emotional. He died because he kept a sacred tradition alive. He offered with reverence. He gave in alignment with heaven's rhythm. His sacrifice was the first evidence that the law wasn't given late. It was known early, remembered by a few, and hated by those who wanted to worship on their own terms. And in that ancient field, we see a truth still alive today. The battle between worship from the soul and worship in spirit and in truth. When Noah stepped off the ark, the world was silent. The flood had washed away generations of violence, corruption, and rebellion. But in that moment of new beginning, Noah didn't first build shelter or seek food. According to the Book of Jubilees, the very first thing he did was build an altar. Not from fear, not from instinct, but from sacred memory. He chose clean animals, offered burnt sacrifices, and reignited the covenant between heaven and earth, not with words, but with fire. This wasn't a spontaneous gesture. Jubilees describes the ritual with precision. The animals selected were pure, unblemished, and fit for offering. The altar was built with intentionality. The blood was shed. The smoke rose. It mirrors the later instructions of Leviticus, but this was centuries before Sinai. Noah already knew the protocol. He wasn't inventing worship. He was continuing it, preserving it, enacting it from knowledge passed down since Eden. And God responded, not just with approval, but with a renewed covenant, one marked by a sign in the sky, the rainbow. But that promise wasn't sealed by a prayer alone. It was sealed by obedience to the sacred rite. The law, once again, had not been introduced. It had been remembered. In this light, Noah becomes more than a survivor. He is a priest, a restorer, a bridge between the world before and the world to come. His sacrifice was not merely an expression of thanks. It was a legal, covenantal act, a way to say, "We have not forgotten." And in doing so, Noah aligned himself with the sacred order God had established from the beginning. So when we see the rainbow, we're not just remembering a promise, we're remembering a ritual, a moment when humanity was invited again to walk in step with heaven. And that invitation, carried by fire and blood on a simple altar, echoes all the way back to Eden and forward to every generation willing to live by the covenant's rhythm. Seth is often remembered simply as the child given to Adam and Eve after the tragedy of Abel's death. But in the Book of Jubilees, his role is far greater, far more foundational. Seth doesn't just carry on a family line, he becomes the guardian of a sacred rhythm, the quiet steward of a divine inheritance that had nearly been extinguished. Where Cain wandered east of Eden and built cities of pride, Seth turned his eyes back to the garden, not in geography, but in spirit. According to Jubilees, Seth was the first to gather a community set apart, not by race or territory, but by a shared commitment to righteousness. He became the father of a lineage that didn't just believe in God, but lived by his ways. These early followers didn't have temples, priests, or scrolls, but they had memory, they had rhythm, they honored the Sabbath, they offered sacrifices in the pattern taught to Abel. They passed down codes of justice, humility, and fidelity, not as laws imposed from above, but as a legacy breathed into them from the beginning. In a world quickly descending into darkness, where the children of Cain built systems of dominance and violence, Seth's line stood in quiet resistance. They lived by a different law, not the law of man, but the law of creation. Jubilees presents this not as myth, but as sacred history. A remnant who kept time with heaven, who guarded the divine cadence handed down from Adam through Abel, and now preserved in Seth. This changes everything we thought we knew about the timeline of faith. The law wasn't introduced with Israel. It was safeguarded through a bloodline long before. Seth's legacy proves that righteousness didn't begin with command. It began with communion, and those who lived in that communion became the first true keepers of the covenant. Through Seth, a lineage was born, not just of flesh, but of memory. A people who remembered Eden not as myth, but as pattern, who lived quietly under the unseen flame of a law that had not yet been written, but had never been forgotten. When we hear the name Enoch, most remember the phrase, "He walked with God." But the Book of Jubilees paints a deeper portrait, one not just of intimacy, but of transmission. Enoch wasn't merely a righteous man lifted to heaven. He was a recorder, a visionary, a prophet entrusted with secrets that predated Sinai. According to Jubilees, Enoch was the first to write down the law, not in reaction to chaos, but as a preservation of order that had existed since the foundation of the world. In visions given by angels, Enoch saw the structure of sacred time, the Sabbaths, the Jubilee cycles, the appointed festivals. He learned the movements of the heavens, not for astrology, but to align human life with divine timing, justice, offerings, purification, the rhythm of rest and worship. These weren't scattered instincts. They were revealed patterns. And Enoch wrote them down. He was shown how time itself was meant to flow, how corruption would twist it, and how the righteous must resist not by power, but by precision. Jubilees describes Enoch as receiving heavenly tablets, inscribed with divine law, with the blueprint of creation's moral and temporal structure. He didn't invent righteousness, he documented it. His writings became the inheritance of future patriarchs, passed silently through generations long before Moses ever climbed Sinai. This challenges our understanding of sacred texts. The law, it turns out, had been recorded before it was codified, written before it was public, protected before it was proclaimed. And Enoch, standing between heaven and earth, became the bridge. Through him, the law moved from vision to word, from heaven's vault to humanity's memory. So when we think of the origin of divine instruction, we must look not to Exodus, but to Enoch. Because long before the commandments echoed from fire and cloud, they were whispered in visions, etched in tablets of light, and entrusted to a man who walked with God and wrote down what he saw. When Jacob awoke from his dream at Bethel, a dream where angels ascended and descended a celestial ladder, he didn't build a monument of power. He didn't carve a tablet or write a decree. Instead, he took a single stone, the one he had used as a pillow, anointed it with oil, and made a vow. That act, quiet and deeply personal, became one of the most profound covenantal gestures in all of Scripture. According to the Book of Jubilees, Jacob wasn't just responding to a dream. He was reviving something ancient, marking time, space, and soul with a sign of sacred memory. The stone wasn't sacred in itself. It became sacred through intention, through his recognition that he had encountered the holy. In that moment, Jacob became the first person to physically mark a place as the site of covenant. There was no priest, no ceremony, no external validation, just one man, one moment, one vow, set in motion by the memory of a God who had walked with Adam, accepted Abel's offering, covenanted with Noah, and guided Abraham through the desert. Jubilees emphasizes that Jacob's action was not random. It was a deliberate return to the rhythm of the patriarchs before him. He promised to walk in God's ways, to give 1/10 of all he received, to honor the sacred order. And the stone stood as a witness, not to a nation, but to a personal renewal of an ancient law. It was not the beginning of a new religion. It was a reconnection to a covenant that had been pulsing underneath history all along. In a world increasingly defined by division, Cain's descendants building cities of pride, Esau chasing power, Jacob's gesture was quiet but revolutionary. He chose remembrance over rebellion. He chose rhythm over chaos. And in doing so, he became the next keeper of the line, the one who reactivated the covenant, not by decree, but by aligning his life to sacred time and space. The stone was not just a marker of where heaven touched earth. It was a testimony that the law could live again whenever one person chose to remember. In the Book of Jubilees, there is a mysterious figure rarely mentioned in traditional readings of Scripture, the angel of the presence. Unlike the more familiar messengers who appear briefly to deliver visions or warnings, this angel has a different role, not to speak a single message, but to preserve all of them. According to Jubilees, this is the being who stood before the face of God, who witnessed creation, covenant, rebellion, and restoration, and who wrote it all down, quietly, faithfully, without fame or fear. When Moses ascended Mount Sinai, most imagine a dramatic encounter, thunder, fire, the direct voice of God. But Jubilees gives us another layer. It says that during those 40 days and nights, it was this angel who delivered to Moses the full account. Not just the 10 Commandments, but the entire history of humanity from Eden onward. Every sacred law, every appointed time, every covenantal moment was dictated by the angel of the presence and written by Moses. The law, then, did not begin on the mountain, it was transmitted there. This changes everything, because it means that the law did not originate in a national context or from human mediation. It was preserved in the heavenly realm, guarded by angelic hands, long before it was ever received by Israel. The angel was not an editor, not a translator, but a steward of a divine archive. What Moses recorded was a copy. The original already existed in the heavenly tablets. The angel of the presence becomes the quiet thread connecting Adam to Abraham, Noah to Moses, Sabbath to sanctuary. He is the invisible guardian of sacred memory, ensuring that the law was never lost, even when it was forgotten. He doesn't shout. He doesn't perform miracles, but his presence holds the timeline of heaven steady, preserving the rhythm of righteousness that so many had strayed from. And so, when we speak of the origin of God's law, we must look higher than Sinai and earlier than Moses. We must imagine an angel writing in silence, recording each covenant, each judgment, each law, not for display, but for restoration, waiting for a generation willing to remember, willing to return. If the covenant began in Eden, before Moses, before Israel, before Sinai, then why was the Book of Jubilees removed? Why did this ancient testimony, which dares to claim that God's law was present at creation, become a text cast into the shadows? And if the Sabbath was sanctified not at Sinai, but during the very first week of existence, woven into the breath of creation itself, why are we told it is only for the Jews? Why did the Church teach that sacred time was ethnic, not eternal? What are we missing? Jubilees doesn't just recount history, it reframes it. It tells us that the law wasn't an interruption in human freedom, it was the rhythm of life itself. That every patriarch before Moses, Adam, Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, walked in the law before it was codified, that angels themselves kept the Sabbath, that sacred time was not invented by religion but remembered by the righteous. And perhaps that's precisely why this book was buried. Because if the law came from Eden, not Egypt, then every soul, not just one nation, holds a piece of the responsibility. If the Sabbath is universal, then every human heart is called to respond. If God's rhythm has always been available, then no religious institution can claim to control it. There's no monopoly on divine time, no priesthood needed to interpret what was already embedded in creation. Maybe the Book of Jubilees was silenced, not because it was false, but because it was too true, because it awakens something uncomfortable. The possibility that the covenant has always been personal, that remembering it is not about joining a system, but about choosing to walk in step with eternity. So the question is no longer just about history, it's about inheritance and whether we are ready to claim it. According to the Book of Jubilees, Adam was not merely the first man, he was the first to receive the rhythm of divine time. Before there were tribes or temples, before there were scrolls or stone tablets, there was Adam and the Sabbath. Jubilees declares that God sanctified the seventh day during creation itself, and he taught Adam to observe it, not as an abstract law, but as a living pattern, a sacred beat pulsing through the days of the week. This means that the covenant didn't begin with Moses on Sinai. It began in the garden, not with rules etched in stone, but with rhythms etched in time. Adam was invited to align his life with heaven's tempo, to rest not because he was tired, but because God did. Sabbath, then, was not about legalism, it was about resonance. It was the first sign of communion between the Creator and his creation, a sign that Adam was not just a being of flesh and dust, but of cadence and covenant. In this view, the law is not merely a list of commands, it is a sacred rhythm, a recurring heartbeat of the divine. It doesn't begin with a prohibition, but with a pause, a breath, a holy stillness that affirms we are not slaves to time, but stewards of it. So when Adam kept the Sabbath, he was not obeying a rule, he was responding to a pattern. He was stepping into a cycle of sanctity that echoed through all creation, a rhythm that called him back each week, not just to rest, but to remember, to realign, to rejoice. And this is the forgotten beginning of the law, not law as burden, but as melody, not as restriction, but as relationship. Adam, the first man, became the first keeper of the holy rhythm, not because he had to, but because it was written into time itself. According to the Book of Jubilees, Abraham was not the inventor of faith, he was its restorer. Long before the law was given at Sinai, long before the commandments were etched in stone, Abraham was already living by them. Jubilees tells us he kept the Sabbath, offered sacrifices according to the sacred order, and walked in righteousness, not because of a written code, but because of an inherited rhythm. He remembered what others had forgotten. Abraham didn't create a new religion, he revived an ancient covenant. He was a man who listened to the divine echo pulsing through time. In a world drifting from Eden's memory, Abraham realigned himself with the original cadence, the sacred time, the holy offerings, the just path. His obedience wasn't revolutionary, it was ancestral. He was the heir of a forgotten tradition that stretched back through Noah, through Enoch, through Adam. Jubilees paints Abraham not as a founder, but as a witness, a man who reawakened the patterns buried beneath generations of idolatry. His life was a restoration of a once vibrant relationship with God, a return to the sacred rhythm broken after the flood and buried beneath the towers of Babel. And because Abraham remembered, God remembered him. The covenant was renewed through him, not because he was perfect, but because he was faithful to what had been. He was chosen not to invent, but to preserve, to carry forward the melody of obedience that began in Eden. Abraham's legacy, then, is not innovation, it's restoration, not disruption, but remembrance. He is the reminder that the law was never about the letter alone. It was about the life that beats in harmony with heaven. And it was this resonance, this return to the ancient tempo, that made his descendants a holy people. Because when one man dares to remember what others have lost, he becomes a doorway for generations. If the law is eternal, then the covenant was never meant for one moment in time or one nation alone. According to the Book of Jubilees, moral law did not wait for Moses to descend from Sinai. It was already woven into the fabric of humanity through the righteous line of Seth, through the visions of Enoch, through the lives of those who chose alignment over rebellion. Jubilees reveals that justice, truthfulness, and the rejection of wickedness were known and practiced long before the tablets of stone. Seth, the son who replaced Abel, began to walk in righteousness, not by instinct, but by inheritance. Enoch was not only a man who walked with God, but one who recorded the heavenly patterns, the Sabbaths, the seasons, the standards of justice that governed both angels and men. These were not new inventions, they were ancient rhythms, and this changes everything. If the law was not created for one generation but revealed from the beginning, then the covenant is not a historical artifact. It's a living invitation. It calls not to a people of the past, but to every soul who chooses to live in step with God's rhythm today, to walk in truth, to uphold justice, to honor sacred time. These are not merely religious duties, they are the signs of a life in covenant, whether or not that person has read a commandment or memorized a verse. The law, in its truest sense, is not a list. It's a path, and anyone who walks that path, knowingly or unknowingly, becomes a keeper of the ancient promise. This means the question is no longer, were you born under Moses, but are you living in harmony with Eden's rhythm? Because according to Jubilees, the law was written into time before it was written on stone. And the covenant is not a relic to be preserved. It is a living reality, waiting to be remembered by each generation. Those who walk it become its heirs, not by bloodline, but by alignment. The Sabbath was not created as a burden. It was not assigned to a single people, nor was it designed as a religious checkbox to fulfill. According to the Book of Jubilees, the Sabbath was woven into the structure of time itself, established in the very first week of creation, before the existence of any nation, before the giving of any law. It is not a rule, it is a rhythm. Jubilees does not speak of the Sabbath as an external requirement imposed upon Israel, but as a sacred inheritance rooted in Eden. It is the language of holy time, a pulse set by the Creator, where heaven and earth breathe in unison once every 7 days. To honor the Sabbath, then, is not to obey a rule for rule's sake, but to speak the same rhythm that God spoke into being. This reframes everything. Keeping the Sabbath is not simply about rest, it is about alignment. It is a way of entering back into that harmony that was broken when man fell out of sync with divine time. When we keep the Sabbath, we are not just stopping, we are stepping into a memory, a melody, a movement that began before we were born and will continue long after us. To live the Sabbath is to remember that time itself can be holy, that not all hours are equal, that some moments carry a presence, not because we feel it, but because they were set apart from the beginning. And those who walk into those moments, whether they know the name of God or not, are stepping onto sacred ground. This is what Jubilees wants us to see. The Sabbath is not about nationality. It's not about legalism. It's about resonance. It is the heartbeat of the Creator whispered into the cadence of creation. And those who live by it are not simply observing, they are testifying. They are becoming a living reminder that time was never meant to be random, but sacred. According to the Book of Jubilees, the law was never meant to be confined by borders, bloodlines, or political covenants. It wasn't given to create division, but to preserve rhythm. Jubilees rewrites the assumptions many hold about the law being exclusively Jewish. It shows that long before Israel ever existed, there were people who lived in harmony with God's sacred order. Seth, Enoch, Noah. None of them were Israelites, yet all of them were covenant keepers. They observed the Sabbath. They brought offerings. They walked in righteousness, not because they had a Torah scroll, but because the rhythm of divine order was etched into time itself. They were not bound by ethnicity, but by alignment. Jubilees paints a picture of sacred time and sacred conduct as universal truths, offered to all who would listen, who would live accordingly, who would keep the right rhythm. This changes everything. The law is not a code assigned to one tribe. It is a mirror, revealing who is in step with the Creator's cadence. Whether born in Jerusalem or the far ends of the earth, those who honor truth, justice, purity, and sacred time are participating in the same covenant that began in Eden, and those who reject that rhythm, regardless of heritage, are walking away from it. The implications are enormous. The law isn't about inclusion or exclusion. It's not about privilege. It's about resonance. Those who resonate with the law are drawn into the covenant not by ritual conversion, but by faithful living. The law was not given to separate humanity. It was revealed to remind us of what had already been written into creation from the beginning. In a world obsessed with lines, national, religious, and ideological, Jubilees offers a deeper truth. What matters is not where you are born, but whether your steps align with the ancient rhythm. That is the mark of covenant. That is the sign of one who walks in the law, not by name, but by nature. According to the Book of Jubilees, the law was never meant to float abstractly in the air or be locked away in scrolls. It was woven into time itself. Time was the first sanctuary. Before the tabernacle, before any stone temple, there was the rhythm of days, weeks, months, and years. And within that rhythm, the law was not merely written, it was lived. Jubilees introduces a sacred framework, the Jubilee cycle. Every 7 years marked a sabbatical year. Every 7 times 7 years culminated in the Jubilee year, a reset, a restoration, a rebalancing of creation. This wasn't an economic policy or a legal technicality. It was music, cosmic music, and every person, every nation, every creature was invited to join the melody. Feasts weren't chosen arbitrarily. They were harmonics on the scale of time, the Day of Atonement, the Feast of Weeks, the Passover, all aligned not just with history, but with the rhythm of heaven. In this view, to obey the law was not to submit to rules, it was to dance in time with the divine. This means sin was not merely a moral failure, it was dissonance. It was stepping off beat. It was refusing to listen to the song that began in Eden and flows through every Jubilee. And righteousness, it was resonance. To live justly was to tune oneself to a frequency older than Sinai. When you understand this, everything changes. The law is no longer a list. It is a calendar. It is not imposed. It is revealed, like the pattern in a symphony already playing. The righteous didn't invent the song. They remembered it. They returned to it. They kept the feasts not to earn favor, but to stay in step with the rhythm of the Creator. In this light, Jubilees doesn't just offer rules, it offers remembrance. A call to remember the tempo of eternity and to let our lives become instruments that keep time with heaven. Not everyone hears it. But if something in you stirred while listening, if a subtle resonance began echoing within your soul, then perhaps you're not just learning something new. Perhaps you're remembering something ancient, something your spirit knew before your mind was taught, a promise once made, a rhythm once followed. The covenant was never just etched in stone. It was never meant to live only in commandments or doctrines. It lives in a Sabbath you choose to honor when no one else does. In a feast you remember though the world has forgotten, in the way you treat a stranger, or in the silence you keep on a sacred day. That is where it breathes, where it waits to be restored. Jubilees doesn't ask you to believe harder. It invites you to live slower, to pause, to listen for the cadence that began in Eden and still beats quietly through time. Not in grand declarations or performances, but in a life aligned with something older, something higher, something holy. If you've ever felt out of place in this world, as if time itself was moving at the wrong pace, maybe it's because your soul remembers a different rhythm. One written by the Creator, not into stone, but into time, into life, into you. Maybe you've done it without realizing. Maybe there was a day when everything felt too loud, too fast, and you chose silence. You turned off the noise, stepped away from the rush, and gave your soul a moment to breathe. Not because someone told you to, not because it was written in a rule book, but because something inside you knew it was time. Maybe that day wasn't Saturday. Maybe it didn't align with the Hebrew calendar or any calendar, but it aligned with something deeper, an inner pulse, a sacred rhythm that didn't need a date to be holy. In that quiet moment, you weren't breaking away from life. You were stepping into it. You were tuning into the same beat that once guided Adam in Eden, Abel at the altar, Enoch in his visions. The Book of Jubilees doesn't ask you to change religions or memorize ancient laws. It simply reveals that sacred time has always been alive, and sometimes, even in a modern world, we keep it without knowing. We return to the rhythm without planning to. We obey the unseen law because our spirit remembers what the world forgot. If you've ever honored a moment, not by tradition, but by intuition, then you've touched the covenant. You've lived the law, not the one carved in stone, but the one written in time, in silence, and in spirit. What if the law was never meant to be a heavy burden, but a sacred rhythm protecting the soul? When you eat what is clean, speak what is true, walk in fairness, and forgive before resentment takes root, you are not just following a list of commands, you are stepping into a divine pattern. You are walking in a current of spiritual alignment that doesn't demand performance, but flows naturally when the soul remembers its origin. Jubilees reframes the law as something far more intimate than rules chiseled in stone. It is a framework of life, a living rhythm, not a legal code. In that rhythm, every act of justice, every moment of restraint, every pause to rest on the right day becomes part of a larger harmony. You're not being forced, you're being remembered. You're being drawn back into sync with something older than nations, deeper than theology, the original design. The law, in this view, is not chains. It is a shelter, a canopy in the storm winds of corruption and confusion. It is the circle that guards the flame when the world turns cold, not to trap the fire, but to protect it, not to control you, but to preserve what is holy in you. To live in this rhythm is not to be shackled, but to be anchored. Anchored in truth, in purity, in mercy, in timing. And when you begin to see the law not as a fence, but as a fire ring, not as a test, but as a refuge, then you begin to see what was always intended, that holiness was never meant to suffocate, but to shelter. If you are living in rhythm with the sacred pulse, then you are already mending the thread torn from Eden. You do not need to wear robes, speak from a pulpit, or be certified by any institution. You don't need approval from a council, a title from a system, or a badge of recognition. Because the covenant was never about titles. It was always about timing, about those who walk in step with the divine beat, even when no one else is listening. If you honor a day that was forgotten, if you choose justice when it costs you, if you turn away from what defiles the soul, not because you must, but because something in you remembers, then the covenant is not lost. It lives in you. You may be the only one in your generation who hears it, but that's enough. One flame in the dark is enough to mark the return of sacred time. One person walking in rhythm is enough to restore what systems erased. One act of obedience in silence is enough to echo across eternity. You are not waiting for the covenant to be given again. It was never revoked. It was never dead. It only waits to be lived again. And maybe, just maybe, you are not merely hearing this message. Maybe you were born for it. Not to announce it with trumpet and noise, but to keep it with quiet faithfulness, to be a keeper of the unseen rhythm, a guardian of the ancient vow, a living scroll written not with ink, but with life. Don't wait for the world to revive it. Live it, and it will breathe again. A week has 7 days. A month follows the turning of the moon. A year cycles through appointed seasons. These are not random, they are sacred rhythms woven into the fabric of creation. And somewhere along that divine pattern is your invitation. You don't need to carry the entire covenant on your shoulders. You don't need to memorize every law, understand every prophecy, or restore the whole calendar overnight. You only need to keep one moment, one appointed time, one sacred pause that aligns your life, not with the world's demands, but with heaven's rhythm. It could be a day you set apart, not because the modern calendar told you, but because your spirit did. A day to rest, to fast, to give thanks, to stop speaking and simply listen. It might look ordinary from the outside, but in the invisible realm, it reactivates a link, one more soul stepping back into the cadence of Eden. When you keep that one day, that one gesture of sacred intent, you become a keeper of something eternal. A living protest against the forgetfulness of the age, a witness that not all has been lost, a remnant who remembers that time is not just passing, it's holy. And when enough people keep even just one day rightly, like tuning forks echoing through the generations, the ancient covenant stirs again, not in noise, but in alignment, not in force, but in faithfulness. You don't need to rebuild the temple, just keep the time. Let your life become a sanctuary of right rhythm, and the covenant will find you. Not everyone can hear the sacred rhythm. In a world that moves fast and forgets easily, the divine cadence is often drowned out, lost beneath the noise of routine, ambition, distraction. Most people walk right past it, unaware that something eternal is still pulsing beneath the surface of time. But if something in this message stirred you, if you felt even a subtle ache, a gentle burning in your spirit, then you may not be just a viewer. You may be one of the few still sensitive to the call, one of the few who can feel when something invisible shifts, when a thread, once thought broken, tugs softly again. That feeling you have, it's not just curiosity. It might be a memory buried in your bones, a whisper from Eden echoing through your soul. And if that's true, then you haven't stumbled into this story by accident. You've been led to it, not to admire it from afar, but to hold it, to guard it, to live it. There is always someone chosen to keep the fire alive, not to shout it, not to market it, but to shelter it in the quiet center of their being. A single ember can light generations if it's kept burning through the long night. You don't need to be a prophet or a priest. You don't need credentials. All you need is the courage to keep feeling, to stay open, to walk differently, even if alone. If the rhythm still moves in you, then maybe you are one of the keepers. Maybe the sacred trust that others have let go has now been passed to you. Don't ignore the flame. The world needs quiet fires more than loud voices. Be the keeper of what others forgot, and the rhythm of the covenant will keep you in return. When one person lives in rhythm, time itself remembers. The calendar of heaven doesn't need global consensus. It revives the moment one soul honors the sacred pattern. A single act done at the right moment, a Sabbath kept, a word withheld, a kindness offered in secret, has the power to reopen what history tried to seal. Truth is not preserved by books alone. It breathes through the life of those who dare to walk faithfully when no one else watches. When someone chooses silence over slander, justice over gain, humility over display, that's when the covenant flickers back to life. The covenant wasn't buried because it was erased from manuscripts. It faded because the rhythm that sustained it was forgotten, not by all, but by many. And now all it takes is one person who hears the quiet call, who chooses to live differently, not out of fear, but out of sacred alignment. Maybe that person is you. You don't need to convince anyone. You don't need a movement. Just one act, one moment, one day lived in holy rhythm, and you become the living page of the covenant. The thread has not been cut. It's waiting to be picked up, woven again through your life. Let this be the day the story continues. Let this be the heartbeat that keeps the covenant alive. One step in rhythm, and eternity responds.